Ladies and gentlemen, please join us in welcoming our next session to stage.
Okie doke, we're back from the break. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm really excited about this next session. Might be a little biased here, but Alchemy is one of my favorite teams in the entire space. They just never stop shipping, and they're just high energy. We're going to be joined by the engineering lead, Noam Hurwitz, who's going to be talking about how account abstraction is fueling user growth. Let's give Noam a big round of applause and welcome.
Thanks, John. Oh, that's loud. Yeah, and thanks to the whole CoinDesk team for putting this together. This is awesome. So welcome, everyone. The talk is titled Account Abstraction. And the subheader here is how we can minimize crypto's complexities for the next billion users. So a little bit about me. I'm Noam. I'm one of the engineering leads at Alchemy. And I've been thinking a lot recently about how to make Web3 more intuitive. A little on Alchemy is we're the top Web3 developer platform, and we're offering all the tools and services that devs need to build Web3 dApps. Kind of where we fit into the ecosystem overall is you can see this 9 grid here and how it applies to the 3 waves of computing. So there was personal computing, internet computing, and now blockchain computing. And at each level, there was kind of a platform layer that provided a standardized interface for developers to build dApps or apps or internet apps on top of. So for personal computing, that was the operating system. For the internet, that was cloud computing. And for Web3, that is Alchemy. Cool. So let's start this by rewinding back to the 1990s. UX then wasn't like UX now. Consumers on the internet were part of countless scams. It attracted some interest, but drove away even broader parts of the population. It was kind of clunky, hard to use, and harder to onboard onto. A famous Nobel laureate quoted, "The growth of the internet will slow drastically." This is in the 90s, right before the Cambrian explosion that we saw in the 2000s and 2010s. And there was a kind of a distinction between internet companies and quote-unquote real companies. So internet companies had new but potentially unorthodox business models. They were unappealing to the biggest spending consumer market, which tended to be older generations. The UX was difficult and somewhat foreign, and scale and infrastructure was limited. And you can contrast this with real companies that had quote-unquote real products and quote-unquote tried and true business models, and their UX was more broadly accepted. Even with all this, though, there was still kind of there was a kernel there that got a lot of people really excited. And now you fast forward 3 decades, and you get this, where today I would argue that every company is an internet company. And even if they don't directly offer internet-related services, essentially all companies provide value to the users via the internet in some capacity. So going to our earlier example of like quote-unquote real companies, General Motors today has generalmotors.com. You can go view their inventory, learn about their cars, and even purchase vehicles on the internet. So internet UX has come a long way in 3 decades, from what we see on the left to what we see now in terms of pretty much every element of how you interact with the internet. You know, a big development there was maybe Ajax in the early 2000s with JavaScript in the browser, but there's been a lot of continual development on what it means to have a good user experience on the internet. And also today, we're seeing similar UX limitations with blockchain. So I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with this screen. It's kind of one of the critical pieces of onboarding to Web3 right now and creates a lot of friction in this onboarding flow. Also today, here's a quote from the same Nobel laureate. "The enthusiasm for cryptocurrencies seems very odd because it goes exactly in the opposite of the long-run trend." And also today, we're seeing a distinction between crypto companies and quote-unquote real companies, where again, crypto companies have new, exciting, but potentially unorthodox business models. The UX is difficult and foreign. And again, it can be hard to attract attention from the largest spending consumer audience, which again skews towards older generations, as opposed to these quote-unquote real companies where generations grew up and are familiar with these products. But again, today, there is a little kernel that people are really excited about. And so how do we get from today to a future in which every company is a crypto company. So again, we want to go from what we have now to something that enables a more frictionless UX and allows truly 1 billion people to onboard to crypto. Kind of how do we start moving away from this? And again, I would argue that UX is one of the biggest blockers in all companies becoming crypto companies, and kind of removing that distinction between crypto companies and companies, much like that distinction is removed between internet companies and companies today. So how do we go from the flows on the left to the flows on the right? And maybe to illustrate this, we can go through a small example in the space of music and Web3. So let's suppose I want to create a new playlist, and you guys are generally familiar with this flow. Spotify, it's a great app. I'm making my playlist for Consensus 2023. It's got a lot of bangers. We're all really excited. And I want to kind of build on the on-chain economy, and I want creators to benefit directly from my activities and enjoying their music. So I find my favorite app, and I start onboarding to this, and I go and I install a wallet, and I try to figure out how to get native assets, and I try to figure out how to KYC, and I try to figure out how to swap tokens into the right asset. And at the end of the day, I kind of resign, and I'm like, OK, never mind. I'm going to try this again later. And we've gotten millions of people on Web3, but we haven't gotten billions of people on Web3. And this UX friction is a big reason why. And so how do we start addressing these UX limitations? I think 2 key takeaways here. The first is we can actually solve these UX problems with what's called a smart contract account. And the second is account abstraction enables smart contract account. So let's go specifically into what does this mean. To do so, we'll start by diving into the technical underpinnings of account abstraction, and then we can go over some of the use cases of what that might enable. So today, there are 2 kinds of accounts on blockchains. There are externally owned accounts, and there are smart contract accounts. And externally owned accounts are the kinds that you guys are familiar with now in your day-to-day when you're creating a new wallet and getting started on Web3. It means essentially the private key that you create as the account is your entire account. So that account is fully controlled by a single secret key that can never change. If you lose that key, it's game over. If that key gets compromised, it's game over. As opposed to a smart contract account that can have whatever access rules it wants. So in general, it would be great if we could have smart contract accounts instead of EOAs. But an issue here is that at least on Ethereum and on most EVM chains, all blockchain activity must be initiated by an EOA. And you guys might have heard the term native account abstraction. And what that means is there are some newer protocols, especially some of the Ethereum layer 2s like Starknet and ZK Sync, that actually have native account abstraction and don't have this limitation. But on Ethereum, on Arbitrum, on Optimism, on Polygon, and where the biggest developer ecosystem is, all transactions must be initiated by an EOA. OK, so we need to solve the problem. We want contract accounts, but we can only start transactions with EOA. How do we fix this? We can introduce an actor called an executor, and maybe the executor can use their EOA to kick off transactions for you. Great. So the flow looks something like this. There's a user. They want to interact with their smart contract account. They send their message to an executor. The executor uses their EOA and writes the message to the user wallet. Fantastic. However, in this example, the executor, which has the EOA, is ultimately responsible for gas. And that's kind of a failure mode of the system in that this one actor can't be responsible for the gas of every single user coming through and writing to their accounts. So what if we say that, hey, as part of this process, my wallet will actually pay you back for gas on the back end. So now the user sends the executor a message. The executor uses their EOA to write that message to a user's wallet, and the user's wallet reimburses the executor for their gas fees. That's great, but that's based a little bit on trust. And in the words of Rihanna, the user wallet better have their money, but we can't actually guarantee that. And it's kind of like one of the core tenets of Web3 to have permissionless, trustless systems. We can't just assume that the user wallet's going to have the gas. We need to cryptographically enforce this somehow. How do we do that? Well, we can introduce another actor that we'll call the entry point. And the entry point's responsibility is to intermediate between the executor and the user wallet. So the new flow now goes, the user sends a message to the executor. The executor uses their EOA to initiate a transaction through the entry point to the user wallet. The message writes and executes on the user wallet, and then the entry point reclaims gas and reimburses the executor. Sweet. So this is kind of a working flow for one user of how they might be able to interact with the smart contract account on Ethereum. One thing to note is that what this executor is doing is actually pretty generalizable and isn't limited to just one actor. So instead of an executor, let's call it a bundler. And if you guys are familiar with ERC 4237, we're starting to converge on the terminology used in that EIP, where we have bundlers that write transactions to smart contract accounts. One other thing to note is that this bundler itself will be censorship resistant by having its own P2P mempool, so that transactions going through bundlers can't be censored, and any other bundler can pick up the transaction and persist it to the chain. So now we have this full bundling flow where we have a lot of users, and they're all sending their messages to their wallets. They get relayed via this bundler, which uses its EOA to write these messages to the wallet via an entry point. The messages execute on the user wallet, and the entry point then reimburses the bundlers for the gas. So one fun fact is we at Alchemy, we're actually writing the server that these bundlers run. So we're writing from scratch a 4237 compliant user operation bundler. It's actually powering a private beta that we're starting this week, and we'll be open sourcing that to the ecosystem in a few weeks. So we're really excited about that development. And kind of without losing sight of what we're going after here, one of the core tenets is improving UX, and a big part of improving UX is improving onboarding. So a big part of onboarding is now when you get started in Web3, you get started with a fresh wallet, and you don't have any assets in that wallet. So you can't actually interact on-chain until you figure out a way to get ETH or get Matic or get any other native token. So what if there was a way for that to be a gasless experience and for a third party to instead sponsor your transactions? So let's introduce the paymaster. And the paymaster's responsibility is exactly that. It abstracts away the concept of gas from end users and allows developers to set gas policies to define the gas experience in the context of their application. And that could mean things like sponsoring transactions, but it could also mean things like paying for gas with stablecoins or paying for gas with any other ERC20. And so we're also writing some of these. We're launching a stablecoin paymaster as part of our private beta this week, and we'll also be launching stablecoin and ERC20 paymasters to follow. So let's put this all together. This is kind of the full account abstraction flow as defined in Ethereum's ERC 4237. We have a lot of users. They're sending messages to their wallets. They get relayed via a bundler that uses its EOA to write these messages to the user's wallets. They go through the entry point, which reimburses the bundler for the gas paid, and actually injects that gas from the paymaster contract. So this is a quick 101 of how account abstraction works technically. But at the end of the day, we're doing a lot of complicated work to get these smart contract accounts. What does this enable? How does this enable us to bring 1 billion people on crypto rails? And the answer to that is like this enables the flows that I demonstrated in the earlier diagram of like the UX that developers and consumers have come to know and love on the internet today. And it actually extends a lot more than this because smart contract accounts are fully programmable, and that means that they're extensible. And there's actually an EIP that we're working with the community here on standardizing the extensible nature of smart contract accounts. But at the core, what this means is that we're moving away from a paradigm where there's one account that fits all applications like we're seeing today. You have an app, you connect your wallet, and you try to figure out how to integrate that app in that wallet. And moving forward, you can actually build accounts that are bespoke built towards the application, with the focus really being on the application and on the account. At the end of the day, for Web3 to succeed, users have to find value in the underlying applications, and they have to have an easy and frictionless way of accessing those applications without the focus being on that account. So in the example of an NFT marketplace, extensibility of a smart contract account might mean providing features like in-app, like account recovery, like a social login, and like a role scoped signing key so that the signer on the account can only trade NFTs, but it can't rug away all of your ERC20 assets. In the context of a payment process, that in an app account experience might mean cross-chain payments. It might mean login with KYC auth, and it might also mean the user pays no gas or pays for gas with stablecoins. And for the game experience, it might mean that they pay for gas with a native token native to the game. And it also could mean that the user session is created once every 6 hours, so you're not constantly signing transactions for every new transaction you're taking on chain. So those are just a few examples of extensibility you can get with smart contract accounts. But again, they're fully programmable, and it's very early, and we're excited to see a lot of what developers might be building in terms of account plugins. And we're excited to kind of power the paradigm of dApp developers becoming plugin developers for on-chain accounts too. So circling back to our previous example, with account abstraction, you can now create a new playlist and make sure your favorite artists get the direct royalties and benefits without the idiosyncrasies of the experiences that we detailed earlier. So you can have your native Web2 style login. You can have the account natively embedded in the application, and you can keep the whole experience natively in-app without having to jump out to a third-party wallet. And that kind of brings us back to the title of this talk, Account Abstraction, is that account abstraction enables developers to provide value to their end users while abstracting away the underlying crypto rails. And those are the rails that generally provide a lot of friction in the onboarding and end user experience. And we want to make sure that developers can focus on capturing value in their application and not interfacing with the underlying technologies. And so again, this is kind of the first step in taking us towards the future, where essentially all companies can provide value to their users via crypto rails in some capacity. And we can remove the distinction between what we have today of crypto companies and regular companies, much like we saw with the internet, in that today all companies are internet companies, and that in 20 years, we expect all companies to be crypto companies too. Thanks, guys. Appreciate listening in.